Please take care of me and my baby.
She was kicked out of her home pregnant and humiliated by her own father. Months later, she returned as a millionaire and engaged to a mafia monster. Each like and comment helps heart pulses touch even more hearts. The main hall of the O'Brien mansion breathed power and tradition, with its crystal chandeliers projecting golden reflections on the Italian marble that covered every inch of the floor. Beatrice Williams stopped at the entrance, feeling the weight of dozens of gazes upon her, but maintained her erect posture even when her legs seemed about to fail. The long black dress embraced her curves with discreet elegance. The jewelry on her neck and wrists were few, but each piece was worth more than everything she had owned in her previous life. She took a deep breath, remembering who she had become, not who she used to be. "Now it's different," she whispered to herself. "Now I have power." Francesco O'Brien observed her every movement from across the room, his face a mask of control that hid the turmoil in his chest. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, but there was something new in her eyes, a strength that didn't exist months ago when she was just a naive, passionate girl. The Italian suit perfectly molded his tall, strong body, every line designed to impress, but for a moment his hands trembled imperceptibly upon seeing her again. He approached with measured steps, each movement calculated to demonstrate absolute control. "I thought I would never see her again," the thought echoed in his mind, like a confession he would never make out loud. The murmurs began the moment Francesco extended his arm to Beatrice, a gesture that in everyone's eyes seemed formal, but which she recognized as silent protection. The most influential families in the city were there, men and women who controlled large family businesses, all eager to discover who this mysterious woman was, who had conquered Francesco O'Brien's reserved heart. Beatrice interlaced her arm with his, feeling the strength emanating from his body, but also the invisible wall he had built around his feelings. His touch burned her skin through the fabric, awakening memories she had tried to bury. "He still feels something," she thought, "or am I just another one of his business deals?" Francesco guided her through the hall with the ownership of someone who had never known fear, but his dark eyes never stopped checking each face, each movement, each possible threat to the woman by his side. She walked with an elegance she didn't possess before, but he could perceive the vulnerability hidden beneath the facade of confidence. When they stopped before the main group of guests, he positioned her slightly behind him, a subtle gesture that blocked any unwanted approach. His voice cut through the air with absolute authority when he spoke, each word measured and final. "Allow me to introduce Beatrice Williams, my future wife." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of a glass shattering against the marble floor. Beatrice didn't need to look to know who had dropped the glass. Her own father's face contorted in a mixture of shock and anger from across the room. For months he had slept thinking about the daughter he had thrown out of the house, pregnant and humiliated, and now she was there as the promised bride of the most powerful and feared man in the city. Francesco noticed the tension that took hold of Beatrice's body, her muscles contracting under the elegant dress, and instinctively positioned himself even more protectively. His hand brushed discreetly against her back, a touch imperceptible to others, but which she felt as an anchor. "He still protects me," she thought, "even after everything." Beatrice's father approached with hesitant steps, his pale face contrasting with the dark suit he wore, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to process his own daughter's transformation. His eyes traveled over the expensive jewelry, the dress that cost more than he earned in a year, the confident posture that had replaced the frightened girl he had sent away. Francesco remained motionless beside Beatrice, but his presence was a silent threat, a reminder that she now belonged to a world where he had no power at all. When the man finally found his voice, the words came out hoarse and laden with regret. "Beatrice, he began, but she raised her hand, interrupting him with a coldness she had learned very well. "Now it's no longer my father who decides my fate." Francesco observed the interaction with calculated interest, studying every nuance of the pain that crossed the face of the man who had rejected his own daughter when she needed him most. There was a dark satisfaction in seeing him suffer, in witnessing the late regret that could not undo the months of tears and solitude that Beatrice had faced. But when his eyes met hers, he saw something that made him hesitate, a vulnerability that she tried to hide behind the mask of indifference. She was wounded, still bleeding inside, and he knew that his own coldness only intensified that pain. The thought disturbed him more than it should have. She doesn't deserve more suffering, he admitted to himself, not because of me. The other guests began to approach, eager to greet the couple and discover more about this surprising union, but Francesco maintained an invisible circle of protection around Beatrice. Each handshake was measured, each smile analyzed, each word weighed before being allowed to reach her. Beatrice responded to the courtesies with studied elegance, but Francesco could feel the tension growing in her body with each passing minute. The questions were subtle, but loaded with malicious curiosity, veiled attempts to discover where she had come from and how she had conquered the most inaccessible man in the city. When one of the women commented on how lucky she was to have found Francesco, Beatrice smiled with a coldness that rivaled his own. Luck had nothing to do with it. Francesco felt a shiver run down his spine, hearing the icy tone in Beatrice's voice, recognizing in it echoes of his own hardness, as if she had learned to protect herself by mirroring him. The idea deeply disturbed him, for he knew it was his rejection that had planted those seeds of coldness in her heart. When she turned to him, seeking silent support in his eyes, he met her gaze for a moment that seemed eternal, and in that instant, the entire ballroom around them disappeared. There were so many unspoken words between them, so many feelings buried beneath layers of pride and hurt, that the air seemed to vibrate with tension. He looked away first, unable to sustain the intensity of that moment. "I cannot allow myself to feel," he reminded himself. "It will only bring pain to both of us." The night progressed, and Beatrice felt her strength draining, the forced smile beginning to hurt the muscles of her face, her legs trembling under the weight of repressed emotions. Francesco immediately noticed the subtle change in her posture, the way she leaned almost imperceptibly toward him, seeking unconscious support. Without a word, he placed his hand on her back, a gesture that seemed casual to observers, but which she recognized as the silent care he had always shown. His touch was firm and warm, an unspoken promise that she was not alone in this hostile world. When she whispered thank you so softly that only he could hear, Francesco felt his heart constrict. "She still trusts me," he thought, "even after everything I've done." The moment was interrupted when one of the older men in the group made a comment about Francesco's interesting choice, the tone loaded with insinuations that made Beatrice's blood boil. She was about to respond when she felt Francesco's hand close more firmly on her back, a silent warning to let him handle it, his eyes fixed on the man with a glacial intensity that made all the other guests instinctively take a step back. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried an unshakable authority. "I suggest you choose your words more carefully in the future." The man paled and quickly moved away, muttering apologies. "No one dares disrespect her in my presence." Beatrice watched Francesco defend her honor with a controlled ferocity that reminded her of why she had fallen in love with him from the beginning, and also why that same intensity frightened her so much. He was a man accustomed to controlling everything and everyone around him, including his own feelings, and she knew she was part of that control. But there were moments like this one, when his mask slipped and she could see the man behind the monster everyone feared. When his eyes met hers again, she saw something that made her shiver, a primitive possessiveness that went far beyond the terms of any agreement. The thought both excited and terrified her. He's not pretending, she realized. There's something real here, even if he never admits it. As the night came to an end and the guests began to say their goodbyes, Beatrice felt the weight of all her repressed emotions pressing against her chest like a storm about to explode. She had managed to maintain her composure throughout the evening, but now with Francesco so close, his masculine scent invading her senses, the memories of what they had shared in the past threatened to destroy her defenses. When he leaned in to whisper something in her ear, feigning intimacy for the last observers, his hot breath against her skin made her close her eyes for a moment. His words were just a low murmur, but they carried a weight that she felt to her bones. "We need to talk when we get home." The word home echoed in Beatrice's mind with a mixture of hope and fear that left her completely vulnerable. She nodded almost imperceptibly, unable to trust her own voice, as Francesco guided her toward the exit. Their footsteps echoed through the empty hall, each sound amplified by the tension growing between them. When he firmly held her arm upon noticing she was trembling slightly, he didn't say a word, just guided her away from the last curious glances. She felt his protection envelop her as it always had, but also the wall of ice he maintained around his heart. The conflict between gratitude and frustration consumed her. Why do you protect me if you can't love me? Francesco O'Brien's penthouse was a perfect reflection of his personality. Minimalist, controlled, and devoid of any touch of human warmth. The dark grey walls contrasted with the straight-lined matte black furniture, while the enormous windows offered a panoramic view of the city that stretched like an empire at his feet. Beatrice observed that urban landscape for the third consecutive morning, one hand resting on her belly that grew each day, feeling like a stranger in a world that didn't belong to her. The silence between them had become a constant presence, heavy and loaded with unspoken words. Like two strangers sharing the same roof, she thought, pretending this is normal. Francesco was sitting at the dining table that also served as his improvised office, the laptop open before him, and stacks of documents organized with military precision around him. He typed with economical and precise movements, but his dark eyes constantly diverted to the woman standing by the window, observing her every gesture with an attention he couldn't control. The way she unconsciously touched her belly, how she bit her lower lip when lost in thought, the way the morning's first rays of sunlight illuminated her profile, creating a golden halo around her hair. He forced himself to return his attention to the computer screen, but the words seemed jumbled. "Focus," he muttered quietly. "She's just temporary." Beatrice moved away from the window and walked to the black leather sofa, each movement more careful due to the extra weight she carried. She picked up the book she had left on the coffee table the night before, a novel she had bought during her months abroad, but couldn't concentrate on reading since she'd returned. She settled among the cushions, adjusting a small pillow behind her back to be more comfortable, and opened the book to the marked page. Her free hand naturally rested on her rounded belly, fingers tracing slow and unconscious circles over the soft fabric of her blouse. The baby moved slightly, as if responding to its mother's touch, drawing a small, involuntary smile from her lips. "At least you want me here," she whispered to the child. "You're the only good thing that came out of all this." From across the room, Francesco had completely stopped typing, his fingers suspended over the keyboard, as he observed the scene before him. There was something deeply intimate in the way Beatrice interacted with the son growing in her womb, a tenderness she hid from the rest of the world, but that naturally emerged in these private moments. He felt a strange pang in his chest, a mixture of protection and possessiveness that he couldn't name nor control. When she smiled at her belly, he had to look away, the image engraving itself indelibly in his memory. The cursor had been blinking on the empty screen for several minutes when he finally muttered between his teeth, "Focus, Francesco. It's just a business arrangement." The hours passed in a tense silence, broken only by the sound of pages turning and Francesco's fingers on the keyboard. Beatrice tried to concentrate on the story she was reading, but the words seemed to dance on the page, her mind constantly returning to the man sitting a few meters away. She could feel his occasional glances, brief but intense, as if he were studying every detail of her presence. When the baby began to kick more forcefully, she pressed her hand against the spot, trying to calm him, and couldn't contain a small sigh of discomfort. The sound was almost imperceptible, but Francesco immediately raised his head, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second before both looked away. He's paying attention, she realized, even while pretending otherwise. Francesco closed the laptop with a sharp movement, pretending to have finished his work, but in reality unable to concentrate with Beatrice there so close and apparently uncomfortable. He rose from the table and walked to the kitchenette, opening the refrigerator with calculatedly casual movements, while his ears remained attentive to any sound she might make. He took a bottle of natural orange juice and poured a glass, adding some vitamins he had discreetly purchased a few days before. He returned to the living room and left the glass on the coffee table beside the sofa, as if it were just a disinterested gesture, but positioned it exactly where she could easily reach it. When Beatrice looked up from her book and saw the glass there, an expression of surprise crossed her face. "I thought you might be thirsty," he said with forced indifference. "Vitamins are good for the situation." Beatrice watched Francesco return to his desk as if nothing had happened, but there was something different in his posture, a tension that hadn't existed before. She picked up the glass and took a sip. The sweet and refreshing flavor of the juice mixed with the slightly bitter taste of the vitamins. It was exactly how she liked it, and he shouldn't have known that. She didn't remember mentioning her preferences, but somehow he knew. The gesture touched her more deeply than it should have, a small demonstration of care that he tried to disguise as indifference. She returned her eyes to the book, but the words were even more blurred now. "Why do you do this to me?" she thought, glancing at him sideways. "Why do you confuse me like this?" The rest of the morning dragged on in a silent ritual of forced proximity and emotional distance. Francesco continued working, but Beatrice noticed that he wasn't really focused, his fingers frequently pausing on the keyboard when she moved or sighed. When she tried to reach for the cushion that had slipped to the floor, he immediately stood up to get it, but stopped midway when he saw that she had managed to retrieve it herself. The moment hung in the air between them, charged with a tension that neither knew how to break. He returned to his desk without saying a word, but Beatrice had seen the concern that crossed his face for a fraction of a second. He cares, she realized with a pang in her heart. He just doesn't want to admit it. When the sun was high in the sky, Beatrice began to feel the weight of fatigue that had become her constant companion in recent months. She closed the book and set it aside, adjusting herself better on the sofa, and closing her eyes for a moment. The baby had calmed down, and she felt a pleasant drowsiness taking over her body. Francesco noticed the change in her breathing almost immediately, the way her shoulders relaxed and her head tilted slightly to the side. He saved the document he was working on and closed the laptop carefully to avoid making noise, his movements deliberately silent. She looked so young when she slept, so vulnerable, that he felt that familiar pang of protection and guilt. She shouldn't be here, he thought, watching her sleep. She deserved something better than this. Francesco stood still for several minutes, just observing the gentle rise and fall of Beatrice's chest, the peace that took over her face when she wasn't pretending to be strong. There was so much he wanted to say, so much he needed to explain, but the words always died in his throat before reaching his lips. He slowly rose from his chair and walked to his bedroom, retrieving the cashmere blanket he kept folded in the closet. He returned to the living room with silent steps, watching her for another moment before carefully unfolding the blanket. When the soft fabric covered her body, she moved slightly, a small unconscious smile crossing her lips. Francesco stood there, watching her sleep peacefully, and for a moment allowed his mask of coldness to fall completely. "I wish things were different," he whispered so low that even he wasn't sure he had spoken. Beatrice moved again on the sofa, turning slightly to her side, and Francesco immediately took a step back, recomposing his neutral expression. But she didn't wake up, just sighed softly and sank deeper into the warm blanket he had placed over her. He took advantage of these last few seconds to memorize every detail of that moment. The way her hair fell over her face, how her hands rested protectively on her belly even during sleep. It was an image he knew he would keep forever, regardless of what the future might bring for both of them. When she began to move again, signaling that she was about to wake up, Francesco had already discreetly disappeared into his private office. If she knew, he thought as he closed the door behind him, if she knew how much Beatrice woke up slowly, feeling more rested than in days, and immediately noticed the soft blanket covering her. She didn't remember covering herself before falling asleep, and Francesco was no longer in the living room. She held the edge of the fabric between her fingers, recognizing the exceptional quality and the subtle perfume it carried, the same masculine scent she associated with security and confusion. She looked around the empty room, searching for signs of his presence, but everything was exactly as before, except for the blanket that someone had carefully placed over her. An involuntary smile curved her lips before she could control it. "You're still there," she murmured to the empty air. "Behind all that coldness, you're still there." Francesco was in his private office, hands pressed against the cold surface of the desk, trying to regain control over the emotions that threatened to overflow. He could hear Beatrice moving in the room next door, probably discovering the blanket and wondering how it had gotten there. The temptation to go back and see her wake up was almost irresistible, But he knew he couldn't allow himself more moments of weakness like that. Each gesture of care he showed only further complicated a situation that should remain strictly professional. He breathed deeply, recomposing his mask of coldness, and opened a new document on the computer. "Keep your distance," he repeated to himself like a mantra. "Don't let her in." Beatrice rose slowly from the sofa, still wrapped in the soft blanket, and walked to the large window that dominated the wall of the room. The city stretched before her like an ocean of concrete and glass, but she barely registered the view. Her mind focused on the man who was somewhere in that penthouse, hidden behind walls and silences. She could feel his presence even when she couldn't see him, an energy that filled all empty spaces and made her feel simultaneously protected and lonely. Her hand rested again on her belly, where a new life was growing, connecting them in a way that neither could completely deny. "What are we going to do?" she whispered to the baby. "How will we survive this without destroying ourselves?" The restaurant exuded discreet elegance, with its soft lights projected by crystal chandeliers, creating an intimate atmosphere among the strategically scattered tables throughout the environment. Beatrice adjusted the navy blue dress that delicately embraced her new curves, the belly already evident under the fluid fabric, while following Francesco through the main hall to the VIP area he had requested. The candles arranged on the dark mahogany table flickered gently, creating dancing shadows on the walls covered with fine wood, and the view to the inner garden offered a visual refuge amid the sophisticated environment. She could feel the curious looks from other customers, but Francesco's protective presence at her side made her walk with more confidence than she actually felt. Another charade, she thought, observing how he pulled out the chair for her with automatic courtesy. Another night pretending we're a real couple. Francesco discreetly checked every detail of the environment before sitting down, his trained eyes identifying exits, positioning of neighboring tables, and any suspicious movement that could represent a threat. It was an unconscious habit, developed through years navigating dangerous waters, but this time there was a different intensity to his vigilance. Beatrice was vulnerable, carrying a child, and every protective instinct in his body was on high alert. When his eyes met hers across the candles, he saw a flash of something that looked like gratitude, mixed with confusion, and he quickly looked away at the menu. Her subtle perfume reached him across the small table, awakening memories he had tried to bury. "Focus on business," he reminded himself, imperceptibly tightening his fists. "This is just work." Beatrice flipped through the menu without really seeing the options, her mind busy trying to decipher the changing moods of the man sitting across from her. In the last weeks of forced cohabitation, she had begun to recognize the subtle signs of his emotions. The way he drummed his fingers when he was impatient, how his jaw contracted when something irritated him, or how his eyes darkened when he was lost in thoughts he preferred not to share. Today there was a different tension in the air, a restless energy that she couldn't fully identify. When the waiter approached to take the orders, Francesco was polite but distant, choosing for both of them without consulting her, a gesture that in other circumstances would irritate her, but which she now recognized as another demonstration of disguised care. "He always knows what I need," she realized, "even when I don't." The dinner proceeded in a comfortable silence, broken only by occasional comments about neutral subjects and the soft sound of silverware against porcelain. Beatrice observed Francesco eating with economical and elegant movements, each gesture calculated and controlled, but noticed how his eyes frequently diverted to check on her well-being. When she hesitated before a dish that didn't completely appeal to her, he discreetly signaled the waiter to bring an alternative without making a fuss about the situation. These small acts of attention touched her more deeply than grand romantic gestures ever could, as they were genuine, instinctive, coming from a place he tried to keep locked. She was about to comment on his kindness when a familiar voice echoed through the restaurant, making Francesco instantly stiffen. "What an interesting coincidence," she murmured, recognizing the predatory tone. "It seems the night just got more complicated." Pietro Murphy approached the table with the calculating smile Beatrice remembered from social gatherings, his light eyes deliberately scanning her figure before fixing on Francesco with false cordiality. He was an attractive man in a conventional way, with perfectly combed dark hair and a suit that cost more than many people earned in a year. but there was something predatory in his presence that made her instinctively recoil. Francesco rose slowly, every movement controlled but charged with a tension that made the air around the table vibrate with dangerous electricity. The two men greeted each other with the icy courtesy reserved for rivals in neutral territory, but Beatrice could practically see the invisible sparks jumping between them. When Pietro turned his attention to her, his eyes softened in an imitation of genuine interest that didn't fool her for a second. "Beatrice," he said, extending his hand to greet her, "you look absolutely radiant." Francesco sat back down with tense movements, but maintained an erect posture and squared shoulders, every line of his body communicating a silent threat that Pietro seemed determined to ignore. Beatrice accepted the greeting with forced politeness, but withdrew her hand as soon as possible, uncomfortable with the way his fingers lingered on hers longer than appropriate. Pietro pulled a chair from a neighboring table without being invited, positioning himself so that he could observe Beatrice closely while keeping Francesco in his peripheral vision. There was a dangerous dynamic developing there, a power game that she recognized but preferred to stay away from. The tension in Francesco's jaw had intensified, and she could see a vein discreetly pulsing at his temple. "May I join you for a few minutes?" Pietro asked, already making himself comfortable. "It's been so long since we've had the opportunity to talk." Beatrice shot a quick glance at Francesco, looking for some sign of how he wanted her to react, but his face had become an impenetrable mask of icy courtesy. Pietro took advantage of the silence to lean slightly toward her, invading her personal space in a subtle but deliberate manner, and Beatrice instinctively backed away, pressing her back against the chair. The movement did not go unnoticed by Francesco, whose eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, but he maintained the iron self-control that had kept him alive and in power for so many years. Pietro began to talk about trivial matters, praising the restaurant and commenting on mutual acquaintances, but his eyes never left Beatrice's face, studying each reaction with interest that went beyond mere social curiosity. "You seem to be flourishing," he said, deliberately letting his gaze slide over her body. "Motherhood suits you very well." The comment made Beatrice inwardly cringe, uncomfortable with the way he observed her, as if she were an object of interest rather than a person. But before she could respond, Francesco spoke in a dangerously low and controlled voice. "My fiancée is fine. Thank you for your concern," he said, emphasizing the word "my" with a possessiveness that made something twist in Beatrice's stomach. Pietro smiled as if he had just discovered exactly what he was looking for, his eyes gleaming with a satisfied malice that indicated he had found an open wound he could exploit. He leaned in even closer, completely ignoring the implicit warning in Francesco's voice, and lightly touched Beatrice's bare shoulder as he spoke. The touch was quick but deliberate, a calculated invasion that made Francesco clench his fists under the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Francesco has always been lucky," Pietro murmured, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second too long, "to find such a special woman at such an interesting time." Beatrice moved away from Pietro's touch with a subtle but clear movement, uncomfortable with the forced intimacy and increasingly aware of the tension emanating from Francesco like waves of heat. She could feel his anger even without looking directly, a dangerous energy that made the air around the table seem electrically charged. Pietro seemed completely oblivious to the danger, or perhaps he was deliberately provoking a reaction, continuing to direct his comments almost exclusively to her, as if Francesco were merely a spectator at his own table. When he began asking questions about her pregnancy, with a false concern that made her feel exposed and vulnerable, Beatrice finally found her voice. "Thank you for your kindness," she said with glacial politeness, "but I prefer not to discuss personal matters during dinner." Her eyes met Francesco's for a moment, and she saw something burning in the dark depths that made her shiver. Pietro did not seem discouraged by Beatrice's cold response. In fact, he seemed to interpret her reserve as an interesting challenge. He leaned back in his chair with a casual confidence that irritated Francesco more than any direct provocation could, and began weaving compliments about her transformation, how she had become sophisticated and elegant during his absence. "You were always beautiful," he said, his eyes traveling over her face with an appreciation that made Francesco clench his jaw hard enough to hurt. But now there is a maturity, a depth that is absolutely captivating. Beatrice felt herself flush involuntarily under the scrutiny, not because of the compliments, but because of the growing intensity of the tension emanating from the man beside her. Francesco had completely stopped eating, his eyes fixed on Pietro with a predatory concentration that served as silent reminders of how dangerous he really was. "Be careful," she thought, directing the warning mentally to both Pietro and Francesco. "This is getting out of control." The situation came to a head when Pietro leaned in once more, this time placing his hand on the table dangerously close to Beatrice's, and whispered with a forced intimacy that made Francesco move imperceptibly to the edge of his chair. "A woman like you deserves someone who truly values you," Pietro said, his words laden with implications that were impossible to ignore. "Someone who doesn't treat you as just another one of his businesses." The veiled insult hit its target with surgical precision, and Beatrice saw the instantaneous transformation in Francesco's face, the mask of civility slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal something primitive and dangerous underneath. He rose from his chair with a fluid, controlled movement that finally made Pietro recoil, his eyes widening slightly as he realized that perhaps he had gone too far. Beatrice felt her heart quicken, not from fear but from a disturbing excitement at seeing Francesco claiming her so visibly. "Now you've done it," she thought, watching the storm forming in Francesco's eyes. "Now you've awakened the beast." Francesco placed enough money on the table to cover the bill and a generous tip, his movements deliberate and controlled, but charged with a tension that made the candles flicker slightly. Pietro stood up too, perhaps finally realizing that he had crossed a dangerous line, but still maintaining that arrogant smile that suggested he had achieved exactly what he intended. Beatrice rose when Francesco extended his hand to her, his fingers closing over hers, with a firmness that was both protective and possessive, and she could feel a slight tremor of adrenaline running through his body. When Francesco spoke, his voice was low and dangerously calm, each word pronounced with a precision that made Pietro take an involuntary step back. "The conversation has been enlightening," he said, his eyes never leaving the other man's face. "I hope there will be no need to continue it." It was a polite but unequivocal threat, and even Pietro seemed to have understood the message. Beatrice allowed herself to be guided out of the restaurant, aware of Francesco's hand on her back, firm and warm through the fabric of her dress, and of the tension radiating from him in almost tangible waves. They walked in silence through the elegant lobby to the elevators, and she could feel the internal conflict happening inside him, the struggle between the civilized control he maintained publicly and something much more primitive and powerful that Pietro had awakened. When the elevator doors closed behind them, the silence became almost unbearable, heavy with unspoken words and emotions that neither knew how to process. Beatrice could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands unconsciously closed and opened, and recognized the signs of a man who was fighting against himself. She opened her mouth to say something, anything that could break the suffocating tension. "Francesco, are you—" she began, but never had the chance to finish. The world seemed to slow down when Francesco turned to her with an intensity that made her completely lose her breath, his dark eyes burning with something she recognized as pure, uncontrolled desire mixed with a primitive possessiveness that made her tremble. Before she could fully process what was happening, he pressed her against the cold wall of the elevator, his large body blocking any possibility of escape, but in a way that was protective rather than threatening. His hands positioned themselves on either side of her face, long fingers tangling in her hair, and when his lips finally found hers, it was with a desperate intensity that spoke of months of repressed desire and jealousy he could no longer control. The kiss was everything she had dreamed of and feared, intense, possessive, charged with a passion he had kept locked up for so long that now threatened to consume them both. When the elevator doors opened with a soft noise, Francesco pulled away as if he had been burned, leaving her breathless and leaning against the wall, with lips still tingling and heart beating so hard that she was certain he could hear it. "What was that?" she whispered, but he was already walking out of the elevator, leaving her with more questions than answers and the taste of him still burning on her lips. Morning arrived laden with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather, and Beatrice awoke alone in the giant bed of the guest room, still tasting the phantom flavor of Francesco's lips on hers. She had spent the entire night reliving every second of that elevator kiss. The desperate intensity with which he had pressed her against the wall, the way his hands had trembled slightly against her face before pulling away as if he had committed a crime. But now, in the harsh light of morning, everything seemed like a distant dream, especially considering that Francesco had disappeared even before she woke up, leaving only the phantom aroma of his masculine perfume in the air and a heavy silence that seemed to scream louder than any word. Beatrice touched her own lips unconsciously, still feeling the residual tingling, and whispered to the empty room, "Why do you always run away when things get real?" Francesco's office in the mansion was a perfect reflection of his controlled personality. Leather bookshelves aligned with military precision, a dark mahogany desk that dominated the center of the room, and windows with heavy curtains that blocked almost all natural light, creating a somber and oppressive atmosphere that perfectly matched his current mood. He had been hunched over piles of documents for hours, desperately trying to concentrate on numbers and contracts, anything that could take his mind away from the memory of Beatrice's soft body against his, from the small, vulnerable sigh she had made when he finally kissed her. His hands were too tense, holding the pen with excessive force, and he had already rewritten the same paragraph 5 times without being able to concentrate on the words. The kiss had been a mistake, a dangerous break in his self-control that could not be repeated. "She is just an agreement," he muttered between his teeth, forcing himself to believe his own words. "I cannot allow myself to feel more than that." Beatrice descended the mansion stairs with hesitant steps, her heart beating strongly in her chest as she headed to his office, determined to clarify what had happened between them the night before. She could hear the muffled sound of papers being handled and the occasional touch of fingers on the computer keyboard, signs that he was working as he always did when he wanted to avoid difficult conversations. The office door was ajar, but she paused at the threshold for a moment, observing him through the gap, noticing the tension in his broad shoulders and the way he seemed to be forcing himself to concentrate on anything except her. When she finally gathered the courage to knock on the door, the sound echoed through the room like a gunshot, making him stiffen even more, though he didn't raise his eyes from the papers. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice carrying a vulnerability she was trying to hide. "We need to talk about last night." Francesco continued writing on his documents with mechanical and precise movements, pretending to be completely absorbed in his work, but Beatrice could see the tension in every line of his body, from his rigid shoulders to his clenched jaw. He had returned to his public persona of a cold and calculating businessman, but she could see the cracks in the facade, small signs that he was not nearly as controlled as he wanted to appear. When she took a step into the office, he finally spoke without raising his head, his voice sharp and professional, as if addressing an unwanted subordinate. "If you've come to discuss the wedding details, the lawyers are already taking care of everything," he said, each word chosen to create distance between them. "There's no need for your participation beyond showing up on the scheduled day." The words hit her like a slap in the face, but she refused to back down. "You know very well that it's not about the wedding I want to talk about." Beatrice felt the familiar burning of rejection spread through her chest, but this time there was something different, a determination that didn't exist the first time he had rejected her. She walked across the office with firm steps, her bare feet silent on the Persian carpet, until she reached the front of his desk, where she stopped and placed both hands on the dark mahogany surface, forcing him to at least acknowledge her presence. The position made her rounded belly more evident, and she saw his eyes quickly dart to the spot before forcing themselves back to the papers. There was something desperate in his movements, as if he was fighting against himself, and this only strengthened her determination to break down the barriers he was erecting between them. "Look at me," she said, her voice low but charged with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "At least have the decency to look at me while you lie about what happened between us." Francesco finally raised his eyes from the papers, but when his gaze met hers, Beatrice almost recoiled at the impact of the calculated coldness she saw there. It was like looking at a stranger, someone who had studied Francesco O'Brien and learned to perfectly imitate his appearance, but who had none of the emotions she had glimpsed the night before. He leaned back in his chair with a predatory elegance, interlacing his fingers and observing her with the same expression he probably used when negotiating contracts or eliminating rivals, completely devoid of any trace of the passion that had exploded between them in the elevator. When he spoke, his voice was low and controlled, each word pronounced with surgical precision designed to cause maximum damage. "What exactly would you like to discuss?" he asked, his head tilted slightly to the side as if she were a mildly interesting puzzle. "The fact that you mistook a moment of weakness for something more significant." Francesco's words hit Beatrice like physical blows, each one designed to diminish what had happened between them, to transform that moment of desperate passion into something sordid and insignificant. She felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break again. There was something different this time, an inner strength she had developed during the months away from him, and she clung to that strength like an anchor. When she spoke, her voice was firm despite the storm happening inside her chest, each word carefully chosen to pierce the armor he had built around himself. "Moment of weakness?" she repeated, leaning slightly over the desk. "Is that what you call it when you finally stop lying to yourself?" She saw something flash in his eyes, a tiny crack in his mask of coldness, but he quickly covered it. "I felt how you trembled when you kissed me, Francesco. That wasn't weakness, that was truth." Francesco rose from his chair with a fluid movement, circling the desk until he was dangerously close to Beatrice. But this time his proximity carried no warmth or desire, only an icy threat that made her instinctively take a step back. He was taller than her, especially when she wasn't wearing heels, and he used this physical advantage to intimidate her, looking down with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing of the man who had pressed her against the elevator wall with desperate desire. When he spoke, his voice was so low that she had to strain to hear, but every word was pronounced with a cruel clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "You want to know the truth?" he asked, tilting his head with a false curiosity that made her blood freeze. "The truth is that you are convenient." He paused, letting the cruel word hang in the air between them like poison. "A temporary responsibility that I accept until you fulfill your purpose." Beatrice felt as if she had been punched in the stomach, all the air leaving her lungs at once as she processed the cruel words he had just pronounced. Temporary responsibility. The words echoed in her mind like a painful echo, reminding her of all the times she had felt disposable, unwanted, a burden to the people around her. She had thought that with Francesco it was different, that beneath all his coldness there was something real, something that made her special in his eyes. But apparently she had been wrong again, interpreting protection and possessiveness as something deeper than they really were. When she finally found her voice again, the words came out hoarse and laden with a pain she couldn't completely hide. "And what happens after?" she asked, one hand unconsciously moving to protect her belly. "After I fulfill my purpose." Francesco observed the protective movement of her hand over her belly and felt something twist painfully in his chest, but forced himself to maintain the merciless expression as he uttered the words he knew would completely shatter her. He could see the pain growing in her eyes, the tears she fought not to shed, and every instinct in his body screamed for him to stop, to pull her into his arms and undo all the damage he was causing. But he knew it would be worse for both of them if he allowed her to nurture hopes that could never materialize, if he let her believe that a man like him could offer something beyond protection and financial security. When he spoke, it was with a coldness that cost more than she would ever know, each word tearing a piece of his own soul. "Afterwards, you will go your own way with a generous amount that will ensure that you and the child will never want for anything," he said, as if discussing the terms of a business contract. "And I will return to my normal life without unnecessary complications." The tears finally overflowed from Beatrice's eyes, running down her cheeks in silent trails that she didn't even try to wipe away, knowing others would come. She had been foolish to think she could mean more to him than a problem to be solved, an inconvenient situation that needed to be managed until it could be disposed of definitively. The kiss from the night before, which had seemed so full of passion and repressed desire, now seemed just as he had said, a moment of weakness he clearly regretted. She stepped away from the desk, away from him, each step a little death as she accepted that she had completely misunderstood his feelings. When she reached the office door, she stopped, and turned to look at him one last time, engraving in her memory the image of the man who had broken her heart twice. "Thank you for the honesty," she said, her voice brittle but dignified. "At least now I know exactly where I stand." Francesco watched Beatrice leave the office without a single word of protest, the sound of her bare feet moving away down the marble corridor echoing like a death sentence in his ears. He remained motionless for several minutes after she disappeared, hands resting on the desk, head down as he fought against the storm of emotions that threatened to destroy the iron control he had built over years. Every cruel word he had said still echoed in the air, and he could taste the bitter taste of the lie on his tongue, the weight of the sacrifice he had made to protect her from himself. He had seen the pain in her eyes, had felt how each word was a stab in his own heart, but he knew it was better this way, better for her to hate him now than to discover later how dangerous it really was to love him. "It was necessary," he whispered to the empty office, trying to convince himself. "She deserves more than I can give." The silence that followed was different from any other that Francesco had ever experienced, heavy with regret and loss, carrying the ghost of the words he wanted to say, but never could. He tried to return to work, forcing his mind to concentrate on contracts and numbers, anything that could push away the image of Beatrice's devastated face when he had called her a temporary responsibility. But the words on the page seemed blurred, meaningless, and he found his hands were trembling slightly as he tried to hold the pen. 2 hours passed in a haze of failed attempts at productivity, until a new sound cut through the silence of the mansion, the distinctive noise of a suitcase being dragged across the marble hallway. The sound made Francesco freeze completely, the pen stopping mid-word, as the reality of what was happening hit him like a high-speed train. "She's leaving," he realized, panic beginning to grow in his chest. "She's really leaving." Francesco rose from his chair so quickly that it spun backward, hitting the bookshelf, but he barely registered the sound as he walked like a sleepwalker to the window overlooking the main entrance of the mansion. His hands pressed against the cold glass as he watched Beatrice appear at the entrance, dragging a suitcase that seemed too heavy for her in her condition, but refusing to accept help from the driver who tried to carry it for her. Even from a distance, he could see the determination in every line of her body, the dignity with which she held her head high despite the tears that still glistened on her cheeks. A dark car waited in the circular driveway, the driver holding the door open as she placed the suitcase in the trunk, and Francesco felt each second pass like an eternity as he fought against the impulse to run down there, to stop everything and admit that he had lied about every cruel word he had said. "Let her go," he ordered himself, fingers pressing even harder against the glass. "It's what's best for her." The moment the car door closed behind Beatrice was like a stab in Francesco's chest, and he watched as the vehicle slowly began to move down the tree-lined driveway toward the main gate. He could have run, could have shouted for her to stop, could have done 1,000 things to prevent her from leaving, but he remained frozen behind the window like a statue, watching the woman he loved disappear from his life for the second time. The car grew smaller and smaller until it was just a distant dot on the road, and then disappeared completely behind the trees, taking with it any chance of happiness Francesco might have had. He didn't move from the window for a long time after the car disappeared, his hands still pressed against the glass, his eyes fixed on the empty spot where he had last seen Beatrice. "What have I done?" he whispered to his own reflection in the glass, the mask of control finally crumbling completely. "What the hell have I done?" The phone rang in the middle of the most important meeting of the month, the strident sound cutting through the tense negotiations taking place in the conference room, and Francesco felt a familiar irritation rise up his throat until he saw the number on the screen. Weeks had passed since Beatrice had left, sleepless nights and days filled with desperate work to keep thoughts of her away, but the number flashing on the screen was from the medical clinic he had discreetly hired to look after her. His fingers trembled imperceptibly as he answered the call, and the doctor's voice on the other end of the line made his world stop completely. Beatrice had gone into premature labor and was being transferred to the nearest private hospital. Francesco rose from the conference table, without a word of explanation to the perplexed executives, grabbed his jacket and ran out through the corridor like a man possessed. "She needs me," he thought, all the walls he had built instantly crumbling. "She needs me and I'm not there." The city traffic had never seemed so slow, each red light a torture, each slow car a personal obstacle between him and the woman carrying his child. Francesco drove with an urgency that made his security guards cling to their seats, overtaking cars when possible and quietly cursing each insignificant delay that separated him from Beatrice. His mind was completely focused on her, on the possibility that something could go wrong, that she might go through it alone because he had been too cowardly to admit his true feelings. The cruel words he had said echoed in his head like a condemnation, each one a reminder of how he had failed her when she needed support and love the most. When he finally arrived at the hospital, he abandoned the car at the main entrance and ran through the corridors until he found her room. "Please," he whispered like a desperate prayer, "let me arrive in time." Beatrice was lying on the hospital bed, her pale face contrasting with the white sheets, but there was still a wounded dignity in her posture that made Francesco's heart contract painfully. She wore a hospital gown that made her look fragile and vulnerable, so different from the strong and determined woman who had left his mansion weeks ago. But when their eyes met across the room, he saw that the fire inside her still burned. She immediately looked away, turning her head toward the window that overlooked an inner garden. But Francesco could see the tension in every line of her body, the way her hands closed over the sheets as if she were preparing for battle. He stopped at the entrance of the room, suddenly insecure, the wrinkled suit from the meeting he had fled making him look out of place in the sterile hospital environment. "Beatrice," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I came as soon as I knew." Francesco's voice made Beatrice close her eyes for a moment, fighting against the storm of emotions that his presence awakened, from the treacherous relief of not being alone to the residual anger over the cruel words he had said the last time they met. She had spent weeks building walls around her heart, convincing herself that she was better without him, that she could raise the child alone without needing the icy protection he offered. But now, seeing him standing there at the door with disheveled hair and eyes full of concern that he couldn't hide, all those walls threatened to crumble at once. A strong contraction crossed her at that moment, making her arch her back and clench her fists, and instinctively her hand extended, seeking support, seeking someone to hold. "No," she muttered through clenched teeth. "I don't need him here." Francesco didn't hesitate for even a second when he saw Beatrice's hand extend, crossing the room in 2 long strides and wrapping her fingers with his, offering his strength without asking permission or waiting for an invitation. His hands were large and warm, calloused from work but gentle when touching her skin, and Beatrice found herself clinging to them like an anchor while the contraction slowly passed. He knelt beside the bed to be at eye level with her, and when she finally looked at him again, he saw unshed tears shining there, along with a vulnerability she was desperately trying to hide. Neither of them said a word during those long minutes, communicating through hand squeezes and looks laden with regret and hope. "I'm not going anywhere," he finally whispered, his voice low but firm as a promise. "Not this time." The hours that followed passed in a haze of pain and expectation, with Francesco remaining by Beatrice's side through every contraction, every moment of panic, every tear she tried to hide. He had taken off his jacket and rolled up his shirt sleeves, transforming from powerful executive into a desperately in-love man who just wanted to be present for the woman he loved. Beatrice fought against the temptation to lean on him emotionally, but her body betrayed her determination, with each contraction that made her squeeze his hand with enough force to leave marks. He never complained, never showed signs of fatigue even when she shouted at him during a particularly painful moment, accusing him of showing up only when it was convenient for him. Francesco absorbed her anger in silence, knowing he deserved every cruel word, every justified accusation. "She has every right to hate me," he thought, but continued holding her hand. "But I won't leave her alone." When the doctors finally announced it was time, Francesco found himself torn between the desire to be present for every second of his child's birth and the fear that his presence was an unwanted intrusion. Beatrice was exhausted, her hair stuck to her forehead with sweat, but there was still a fierce determination in her eyes when she looked at him and nodded almost imperceptibly, a silent permission for him to stay. He remained beside the head of the bed, whispering words of encouragement when she seemed to be losing strength, reminding her how strong she was, how he believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. With each passing moment, Francesco felt as if he were being remade from within, all his priorities rearranging around the realization that he was about to become a father. "You can do it," he murmured against her temple. "You are the strongest woman I know." The baby's first cry filled the room like celestial music, a sound that made both Francesco and Beatrice start crying simultaneously, all the tension and fear of the past few hours dissolving into pure relief and overwhelming joy. Beatrice was completely exhausted, but her eyes shone with a happiness that Francesco had never seen before, pure and unadulterated by any of the complications that existed between them. When the nurse placed the baby in her arms, still red and wrinkled but perfectly formed and healthy, Beatrice finally let the tears flow freely for the first time in weeks, all her artificial strength crumbling before the perfection of the miracle she had created. Francesco watched the scene through his own teary eyes, feeling as if his heart would explode with emotion. "It's the most beautiful baby in the world," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion, perfect like his mother. Francesco extended a trembling finger to gently touch the baby's tiny cheek, amazed at the softness of the skin and the fact that this perfect creature had been created by him and the extraordinary woman who held their child with such love. The baby stirred slightly at his touch, a small fist opening and closing, and Francesco felt as if he was being struck by a bolt of pure emotion that completely reorganized everything he had believed about himself. He wasn't just a cold and calculating businessman, wasn't just the heir to a dangerous family. He was a father, a protector, responsible for this small and precious life that would depend on him for everything. When he looked at Beatrice and saw the absolute love in her eyes as she observed their son, he knew there weren't enough words in the world to express what he felt. "He's ours," he said, his voice full of wonder and gratitude. "Really ours." Beatrice raised her eyes from the baby to meet Francesco's gaze, and for a moment, all the hurt and resentment of the past weeks seemed insignificant in the face of the magnitude of what they had created together. She could see the transformation happening in him in real time, the cold and controlled man giving way to someone completely vulnerable and open, someone who was discovering what it meant to love unconditionally for the first time in his life. There were tears streaming down his cheeks with no attempt to hide them, and when he reached out to touch her face with the same gentleness with which he had touched the baby, Beatrice felt the last defenses around her heart begin to crumble. He didn't say, "I love you," didn't ask forgiveness for cruel words, didn't try to explain or justify his fears. "We're a family now," he whispered, the simple words carrying more weight than any elaborate declaration could, "and I will never let you go again." Beatrice looked into Francesco's eyes and saw there not just regret but a promise, a commitment that went beyond words or contracts or business agreements. She saw a man who had found his purpose, his anchor, his reason to be better than he had ever dreamed possible. When she intertwined her fingers with his, still carefully holding the baby in her other arm, it was like sealing a pact that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. They had gone through pain and separation, through wounded pride and cruel words, but in the end they had found something that was greater than either of them individually. "Her family," she repeated, her voice soft but loaded with acceptance and hope. "We are a family." And for the first time in months, Beatrice felt she was exactly where she belonged. If Beatrice and Francesco's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like and comment where you're from. And don't go anywhere. The next story is already appearing on the screen, made especially for you. See you soon.